As liberating and progressive as the underground comics movement was, it was not destined to last. When comics began to register on mainstream society's consciousness, there was a large outcry against them. They were deemed obscene and subversive and far too explicit for a medium geared towards children. Completely ignored was the fact that the underground books were not aimed at children at all. Among the most damaging factors in the eventual downfall of the underground movement, a Supreme Court ruling deemed that individual communities would establish their own guidelines for interpretation of the First Amendment with regards to obscenity, and as a result, numerous laws were passed across the country that prohibited the production or sale of comics in many areas. Such community standard obscenity laws are still being leveled against comic books, their creators, and retailers even today. A changing social climate also contributed to the eventual collapse of the underground movement. American involvement in the Vietnam War had ended, leaving artists with one less thing to speak out against. The values espoused by the comics of the late 60s and early 70s started to become mundane and lost their novelty. Punk was becoming the new counterculture, and by definition, hippies and flower children were considered the enemy. Heroin was quickly replacing marijuana and LSD as the drug of choice in the nation, and particularly within the Haight-Ashbury district, which was one of the major focal points of the underground movement, and where many of the greats among underground artists began. Unfortunately, a number of talented artists lost their lives to addiction. Head shops came under attack by the establishment, and most were closed down, depriving the underground of a key source of distribution. Lawsuits were being filed left and right against comics creators and publishers for advocating drug use and associating with the now illegal head shops. And the publishers who didn't have the money to fight these costly legal battles simply shut down. Reeling from these blows, but not beaten, comics creators began to tone down their content and change directions from gratuitous sex and violence to themes that would be more acceptable to the mainstream. Some of these carried political messages and agendas. Others were humorous, poking fun at society without the explicitness of their predecessors. Both new genres were well received by the public, and some were seminal underground works. Zippy the Pinhead, pictured above, became particularly popular. Each of the more politically motivated books typically advocated a specific cause or ideology, whether it be the environment, nuclear power, anti-war sentiment, gay and lesbian rights, corporate greed, the industrial complex, or any one of a number of these other subjects. These comic books were satirical in nature, smart and sophisticated, and definitely not for children. Slow Death was one of the earliest and longest running of these political comics. Increased commercialism also did its part to end the underground movement. With all the controversy surrounding underground comics, a number of companies wanted to cash in on their notoriety. Comics publishers started to branch out into merchandising and wanting to make a quick buck. They began adopting the very business practices that steered underground artists away from the mainstream publishers. Movies, television, and the mainstream comic book industry itself began to assimilate the underground comics style and attitude. Marvel Comics, one of the big two of mainstream comics, even lured a number of prolific underground artists to do watered-down versions of their work for a short-lived series called Comics Book. Pretty soon, what was once underground became just the same old thing.